Hey guys, and welcome to The Broken Sword. In today's video, I thought we would put together a collection of our videos on all the information we've put out on the Rings of Power. The One Ring, the Elven Rings, the Dwarven Rings, and of course, the 9 rings for the men. Now, as these videos were of course released sometimes months apart, some of the audio or video quality may be slightly different, so please forgive us for that, but hopefully you enjoy having this information all in one place. Let's get into it.
Build me an army worthy of Mordor.
Let's start at the very beginning, the forging of the Great Rings of Power. In the year 1200 of the Second Age, the elves of Eregion began receiving great things from one calling themselves Annatar, Lord of Gifts. Annatar offered the elves his help and his vast knowledge to aid them in their power and influence in Middle-earth. However, even in this generous and kind form, Annatar was not trusted by all of the elves, particularly Gil-galad, Elrond and Galadriel. They were extremely suspicious of his deeper intentions. Although there were many jewelsmiths that were far more welcoming of Annatar, and their leader, Celebrimbor, accepted the gift of knowledge from this mysterious character. Annatar would remain in Eregion over the next few hundred years, helping the already very skilled smiths with their crafts that they loved. It wouldn't be long before the elven smiths, under the guidance and tuition of Annatar, forged the Rings of Power. 16 rings were made, and with their completion, Annatar left Eregion. However, the elves had a hidden agenda. They were to use the knowledge that they had gained from their teacher, from this bringer of such great gifts of knowledge, to create their own rings. 3 rings of power, Nenya, Narya and Vilya. These 3 rings were far more powerful than the 16 that were previously created. Now, as I'm sure you already know by now, the elves had been deceived by this great deceiver. Annatar was of course Sauron, and Sauron had in secret forged a master ring that would rule over all of the others, using dark magic that he had taught them to use during the forging process of the others. But as we know, Sauron was unaware of the existence of the 3 Elven Rings, meaning he had no power over them. So in the year 1697 of the Second Age, Sauron waged war upon Eregion. He killed Celebrimbor and took the Rings of Power for himself, with the exception of the Elven Rings. With these powerful rings now in his possession, Sauron decided to use them as gifts. Gifts of deception, of course. He gifted 9 to great and powerful men in Middle-earth, telling them that the rings would grant them great power. However, just as the elves had been, the men were deceived, and soon began to bend to Sauron's will, fading more and more until they had no will of their own, and would eventually be 100% under the command of the Dark Lord, becoming ringwraiths. Spectral creatures that only wish to obey their new master. Sauron wanted to use the other 7 rings to do the same with the dwarves, gifting them to great and powerful dwarves, promising them fame and riches. But it did not work as planned, as the dwarves proved far more resistant to Sauron's magic than the men. As we know, in Middle-earth, men are easily corrupted. Then hundreds of years later, with Middle-earth falling further and further into darkness under Sauron's control, the combined armies of elves and men would form an alliance to march on Mordor and wage war on Sauron and his forces. The alliance was led by the great kings of each race, the men by Elendil of Numenor and the elves by Gil-galad of Eregion. The war lasted for years, and with the alliance finally being able to push the forces of Mordor back to the slopes of Mount Doom, Sauron himself had no choice but to enter the battle. He killed both of the great kings, but in doing so, he was also killed himself. Then the son of the king of Numenor, Isildur, took up the remains of his father's broken sword and cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand, finally defeating him and forcing the remaining dark forces to flee. Victorious in the war, Isildur had the chance to destroy the ring there and then, but like I just mentioned, the will of men is easily corrupted. So Isildur decided to keep the ring for himself, thinking it would bring him great power. But it was just 2 years later, while riding through the Gladden Fields with his company, that Isildur was ambushed by an orc party. Here the ring betrayed Isildur, slipping from his finger and falling to the bottom of the river Anduin. Over the next 2,500 years, darkness began once again to spread over Middle-earth. The ring had waited at the bottom of the river until it was time for it to find a new bearer. It wasn't until 2463 of the Third Age that the ring was picked up by one of the river folk named Deagle, who happened to come across it while fishing. However, the influence of the ring quickly corrupted Deagle and his friend Smeagol, leading to Smeagol to kill his friend, taking the ring for himself, becoming 100% dominated by the ring. A few years later, Smeagol ventured into the Misty Mountains to have some alone time with his precious. Over the next 500 years, the ring completely consumed him. He forgot much of his own past, he forgot even his name, and became the creature known as Gollum. The ring would then stay with Gollum until it decided it was time to leave once again. So then it abandoned Gollum, trying to find a new way to return to its master. Then the next step in the ring's journey was unplanned. It was picked up by another of the most unlikely creatures, a hobbit, Bilbo Baggins of the Shire. Bilbo had gotten lost in the Goblin Caves during the quest of Erebor and came upon the ring, using its powers of invisibility to escape the caves. It just so happened that the hobbits actually have a very strong natural ability to resist the ring's power, and so he did not fall under the ring's influence. But then, on his 111st birthday, in the year 3001 of the Third Age, Bilbo decided to leave the Shire and journey to Rivendell once more. After some convincing from Gandalf, who could see the ring very slowly having an effect on Bilbo, he decided to leave the ring to Frodo. 17 years after Bilbo left the Shire, Gandalf returned, having discovered the truth of Bilbo's ring. The truth that it was in fact the One Ring, something that the Hobbit had never known, just thinking of it as a magical ring. Gandalf tasked Frodo then with taking the ring in secret to Rivendell, and after a perilous journey, Frodo and the ring made it to the Council of Elrond in Rivendell, and the council was made to decide the fate of the ring. Should it be kept safe? Should its power be used? Or should it be destroyed forever? After a great debate with many conflicting opinions, it was decided that the ring should be destroyed, and Frodo was once again chosen to bear the great burden that is the ring. It would be taken to Mordor, to the great fires of Mount Doom, the one place it could be destroyed. And so a fellowship was formed, and the quest to destroy Sauron forever began. I am sure you all know the story from here on out in great detail, so I won't end this video by just recapping the Lord of the Rings. But yes, Frodo eventually succeeds in the task of destroying the One Ring in Mount Doom, with a lot of help from Samwise Gamgee. According to Gandalf, a feature of the Rings of Power that seemed to be shared amongst them all was that a mortal that wore one of them was granted a lifespan far greater than their natural one. It's assumed that this side effect was actually unintentional, as the rings were initially intended to be worn by elves, who were of course already immortal. So the three Elven Rings were Narya, Nenya, and Vilya. Now while these rings were not created to be weapons of war, or as a means to dominate others, their purpose was to protect the elven lands where their wielders resided, and to aid in the healing and resisting of evil, although they were still linked to the One Ring in some way, and whoever wore the One Ring could, with great effort, see the thoughts of those who wore the three. Each of the three rings had special properties, but their powers were quite limited. Narya, also known as the Ring of Fire, was a ruby set in a gold band. It was given by Celebrimbor, along with the Ring Vilya, to Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor during the Second Age. Gil-galad entrusted Narya to his lieutenant Círdan, Lord of the Havens of Mithlond, who kept it after Gil-galad's death. After the arrival of the Astari in the Third Age, Círdan, who knew of Gandalf's true duties, gave the ring Narya to him to aid him in his quests. "Take this ring, master," he said, "for your labours will be heavy, but it will support you in the weariness that you have taken upon yourself. For this is the Ring of Fire, and with it may you rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill." It was only Círdan, Elrond, and Galadriel that knew Gandalf had the ring throughout the Third Age. Not much is known about when or if Gandalf really used its powers, but we do know that during the siege of Minas Tirith he inspires hope and courage in men wherever he passes. This is a good example of Narya's power. It's said that it had the power to inspire others to resist tyranny, domination, and despair, and to hide the wielder from remote observation except by the wearer of the One Ring. It's also thought to have magical properties and fire powers. It's assumed that Gandalf kept the ring as a relic when he journeyed to the Undying Lands. Moving on to Nenya, also known as the White Ring or the Ring of Water. It was the Elven Ring possessed by Galadriel. It is described as being made of mithril set with a white stone. Nenya's power was said to be preservation, protection, and concealment from evil. Galadriel took advantage of these powers by creating and protecting Lothlorien. It's said that, while protected by Nenya, Lothlorien would not fall unless Sauron had personally come to attack it. It's not really clear to me exactly what this power means, as we know that Lorien had definitely been attacked by orcs before, so it doesn't exactly hide it. I would assume it's more of a case of its presence cannot be detected unless Sauron wears the One Ring. Anyway, after the defeat of Sauron, the power of Nenya faded, and with it so did the beauty and magic of Lorien. It was gradually depopulated, and by the time that Arwen went there to die in the Fourth Age, it was deserted and in ruin. Finally, Vilya, also known as the Ring of Air, the Dominant Ring, or the Ring of Sapphire, was the greatest of the three rings. Like the other two Elven Rings, it was jeweled. It contained a great blue stone set in a gold band. After Sauron destroyed Eregion, Vilya, along with Narya, was sent to Gil-galad far away in Lindon, where it was later given to Elrond by the High Elven King. As Gil-galad was the High King of the Noldor Elves at the time of the ring's distribution, it was thought that he was the most fit to take care of the most powerful of the three rings. So Elrond bore Vilya for the later years of the Second Age, as well as all of the Third. It's not as clear what Vilya can actually do. It's pretty reasonable to assume that it also has the power to heal and preserve, as it's mentioned in the Silmarillion that Celebrimbor actually created the rings for this reason. It has also been speculated that the ring had minor control over some of the elements, like when Elrond summoned water to attack the Nazgul as they attempted to invade Rivendell. It's also possible that it is the ring that gives Elrond the gift of foresight, but it's just as likely that these powers were natural gifts of him alone. After the destruction of the One Ring and Sauron's defeat, the power of Vilya also faded, and it was taken by Elrond, along with Nenya and Narya, with their wielders Galadriel and Gandalf, to the Undying Lands at the end of the Third Age. Now, let's begin with the distribution of the Seven Rings. It's most commonly assumed that Sauron created the rings and then divided them between men, elves, and dwarves, as I just stated, but that's not actually the case. Sauron had originally intended for them to all be used to corrupt the elves. But after the creation of the One Ring set his plans into motion, the elves became aware of the situation and took off their rings. Though the three most powerful rings were kept hidden and secret, Nenya, Vilya, and Narya, the others were reclaimed. It was then that Sauron decided to attempt to corrupt both men and dwarves as well. Just as intended with his original plans, Sauron gave his so-called gifts to the dwarves for them to wear, then tried corrupting them using his One Ring. Though once again his plan failed. It turns out that not only are the dwarves too hardy and resolute to be controlled and manipulated, but he also gave them to the strongest kings and lords of the race, making it even harder for them to be corrupted. So rather than fall into Sauron's dark magic, the Dwarven Ring-bearers accumulated great wealth. As the rings essentially intensified their greed, they became consumed by it. As the rings were likely given to the kings of the seven houses of the dwarves, it was because of the seven rings of power that the dwarves accumulated the seven hordes of the dwarf kings. In case you are not aware of what these are, they were the legendary treasures of the dwarves. Each horde belonged to one of the dwarven clans. By the time of the Third Age, most of these hordes were plundered or devoured by dragons, who also had a liking for treasure. Due to the rings bringing in wealth and treasure, which in turn attracted dragons, it should come as no surprise to discover that 4 of the 7 rings were melted under the flaming breath of these dragons. However, Sauron managed to recapture the remaining 3 following his return to prominence. He made an attempt to use these 3 rings as a way of bribing the dwarves to pledge their allegiance to him. Of course, this offer was declined. But this begs the question, at least to me, why did Sauron even want these rings back? To just give them back out to dwarves he already knows are incorruptible? It doesn't really make much sense. Tolkien does say that the 7 rings failed to corrupt the Dwarven kings the way the 9 rings succeeded with the Nazgul. So I think it's reaching a bit far to suggest that the 7, as originally presented by Sauron to the dwarves, succeeded in turning any of their wearers to evil. The dwarves were especially resistant to the domination of their wills by an external will, but the rings did increase their greed, pride, and anger. So having seized 3 of the 7, why would Sauron offer them to Dane Ironfoot at the end of the Third Age, as reported by Gloin at the Council of Elrond? If the offer was in fact sincere, we must wonder if Sauron had done something to the rings, perhaps hoping to succeed with them in a way he had not done before. It might also explain why Sauron would be willing to give out the 3 remaining rings to Dane. If he had further perverted the rings, perhaps he felt he would have a better chance of enslaving a Dwarven king the second time round. If the dwarves could be united in war once more, Sauron would much have preferred to have them fighting for him than against him. But as we know, the rings were never gifted out again and presumably were destroyed when Barad-dûr collapsed, or at the very least, they likely lost all of their powers when the One Ring was destroyed. Now, I want to talk briefly and more specifically about one of the 7 rings. In fact, it's the only Dwarven ring that we ever really get any specific information about, the Ring of Thror. It's actually said that this ring was originally given out by Celebrimbor himself. He gave it to King Durin III of Khazad-dûm. It remained then in the House of Durin for thousands of years, all the way up to the desolation of the Lonely Mountain by Smaug, and at this time the ring was now with Thror. After the kingdom's destruction, Thror passed the ring on to his son Thrain. Eventually Thrain set out on an ill-fated quest to regain his kingdom, but he was captured by the spies of Sauron, and the Ring of Thror was lost forever, as Sauron took it from him by force in the dungeons of Dol Guldur. Many dwarves, however, did not know the fate of the ring and thought it was lost in Moria when Thror was killed by Azog. It was actually thought that one of the reasons that Balin wished to reclaim Moria was to find this ring. In the Council of Elrond, Gandalf told Gloin that Balin would not find the ring there as it was given to Thrain and lost in Dol Guldur. Now, that's pretty much all of the information we have on the 7 Rings of Power. As I said, it's one of the areas that Tolkien wrote very little about, but these are often the areas I find most fun to dissect because we can speculate and theorize and piece it together and try and find a full story. The majority of the information we are really given about these rings is summarized in one paragraph from the Silmarillion in the chapter of the Rings of Power. I will leave you today by reading you this passage. And all those rings that he governed he perverted, the more easily since he had a part in their making. And they were accursed, and they betrayed in the end all those that used them. The dwarves indeed proved tough and hard to tame. They ill endure the domination of others, and the thoughts of their hearts are hard to fathom, nor can they be turned to shadows. They use their rings only for the getting of wealth, but wrath and an overmastering greed of gold were kindled in their hearts, of which evil enough after came to the prophet of Sauron. It is said that the foundation of each of the 7 hordes of the dwarf kings of old was a golden ring. But all those hordes long ago were plundered and the dragons devoured them, and of the 7 rings, some were consumed in fire and some Sauron recovered. So before we get started, it's important to note that this is one of those subjects that Tolkien wrote very little about. We have just as little information on these rings as we do on the Nazgul themselves. But there is enough info out there that we can use to piece together to figure out what happened to the rings themselves. So although never confirmed, it seems like the 9 rings of power that were given to men were pretty much the same as the 7 that the dwarves received. Even if they were different in appearance, they had pretty much the same effects. Sauron chose to give the 9 to men because he knew that they would be the easiest to corrupt. In time, the 9 wearers of these rings would fade into Nazgul, wraiths of great power that served Sauron and no longer had any will of their own. It's important to note that the fact that the 7 did not corrupt the dwarves is mainly because of the resilience of the dwarves, and nothing to do with the rings themselves. Were a man to wear one of the 7, he would likely still become a wraith. The 3 Elven Rings were completely different altogether, but that is due to them being created solely by Celebrimbor. So the effects of the 9 were that each wielder would acquire great power and great wealth and become powerful sorcerers. They were also granted a seemingly immortal life, something that men often wish for, as they were envious of the elves that would live forever. However, one by one, depending on the ability of the individual to resist evil, they would completely fall under Sauron's control, as I mentioned, having no will of their own. They also became completely invisible to everyone other than elves who had once dwelled in the Undying Lands, and Maya such as wizards and Sauron himself. They were all linked to Sauron. When his power was weak, the wraiths were also pretty powerless, and when he grew in strength, they became more powerful, to the point where their leader, the Witch King of Angmar, was presumably able to match Gandalf the White at his absolute peak. So what exactly happened to these rings? This is a much debated issue, as there are some contradicting statements within Tolkien's works regarding the matter, but I think we can clear this up. Most people seem to believe that the Nazgul wear their rings permanently, as this is how Sauron enslaves them. However, the only clear statement to back this up is when Gandalf states, "the 9 the Nazgul keep." Seems pretty definitive, right? Well, no, not really. Most evidence actually points to the fact that Sauron himself actually keeps the rings. In the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf explains to Frodo about the history of the ring and says, "So it is now, the 9 he had gathered to himself, the 7 also, or else they are destroyed, the 3 are hidden still." Galadriel also backs up this information when she says to Frodo, "You saw the eye of him that holds the 7 and the 9. And finally, we have the following passages from the Unfinished Tales that I believe fully secures this theory. At length he resolved that no other would serve him in this case but his mightiest servants, the Ringwraiths, who had no will but his own, being utterly subservient to the ring that had enslaved him, which Sauron held. They were by far the most powerful of his servants, and the most suitable for such a mission, since they were entirely enslaved to their 9 rings, which he now himself held." These statements very clearly tell us that Sauron and not the Nazgul were in possession of the rings. If you need any further convincing that the Nazgul never actually wore them, I will read you a sentence from the Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, number 246. "They would have obeyed or feigned to obey any minor command of his that did not interfere with their errand, laid upon them by Sauron, who still, through their 9 rings, which he held, had primary control of their wills." So, to summarise, I think that after Sauron claimed the 9 rings, he gave them to the mortal men, who then used the rings to gain power. In doing so, they poured their will and essentially their souls into these rings and became invisible wraiths. At this point, Sauron must have took back the rings and used them to control the wraiths and make them his most feared servants. I would then assume that with the destruction of the One Ring and the defeat of Sauron, the rings were also destroyed. My question for you guys today is this: would you like more of a backstory on the Nazgul, or do you enjoy this more mysterious side to them? Personally, I am hoping we get to see more of them in the Amazon Prime show. I actually have a theory that the main antagonist for Season 1 will be a man that towards the end of the season will be revealed to be a Nazgul in some kind of big twist. I only think this because it has been confirmed that Sauron will not be appearing in the first season, so we need some sort of villain. The Witch King would probably be my best bet. Okay guys, that's it from me today. Thank you all so much for watching. Before we go, please don't forget to check out our other channels. We cover a variety of different fandoms, from of course Middle-earth, to Dragon Ball, to Power Rangers, and the latest one, Batman and DC. So go and check those out if they interest you. The links will be in the description. Of course, before we go, I'd just like to thank our patrons and channel members. You guys are the absolute best. We can't wait to bring you more updates on the short film that you are funding very soon. Again, I hope you all have a great day. Thank you so much for your time watching this video, and I will see you next time on The Broken Sword.